This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again Dr. Buck Melton, possibly one day to be Vice President. Buck Melton.
It's still, I've taken it under advisement.
Okay, we continue.
The campaign committee forms.
We continue to await developments here, Buck, as to what could happen. And I noticed tonight that you have a little cold here, little sniffles. That brings up the idea about the coronavirus. And are you nervous about that? Would you have any thoughts?
No.
Has it interfered with your life thus far?
Not a bit. On the other hand, I have read The Stand by Stephen King, and so every time someone sneezes, that comes to mind.
Oh, is that right?
It's interesting because Stephen King, I don't know if you've read him or not, the man needs an editor in the worst way. But I will occasionally ask my students if they still read Stephen King, and a lot do, and then I say, have you ever read The Stand, when I get ready to introduce them to the Black Death. And all these people who read King have never read The Stand. This is his opus, his masterpiece about a bioengineered bug that escapes the lab and kills 99% of the population within about 3 months' time.
Yes.
So
it's interesting with, at least that's one theory. I mean, the idea is that this virus sprang from so-called wet markets. I don't know if you've been to China, but it really is an impressive thing to see for a Western tourist walking around. Every kind of animal, every creature under God's sun, it is there. Rats, whatever, squirrels, owls, I don't know, whatever, snakes, everything, every creature that exists. Jellyfish, everything is there, all sort of mingled together. And the idea that, well, I think the virus jumped from bats, which are mammals, to anteaters, and find someone eating one of the anteaters, which is on the cuisine. Somehow it's made its way into our Homo sapien population. Well, that's at least the general idea. But some people have the idea, which is kind of, I mean, we can sail the ship into that, the mythology or these paranoia that this may have escaped from a lab in China, exactly the Stephen King idea.
Yes.
And so I think on the internet, people are saying maybe this is what happened, or maybe there's some conspiracy to do this. And that goes along with fear and what it can do to people. And if the virus got out of hand, presumably it could be a really cataclysmic event. We can all know the story about the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 that killed more people than did World War I. Millions of people died. These episodic events happen. And you mentioned the Black Death, which certainly was somewhat of a revolution. And it paved the way for you could say the Renaissance.
Yes.
In a way, you could say that. So these great die-offs have an impact. Any thoughts about what happened after the Black Death in Europe and what changed things?
It helped bring about an end to feudalism, a radical redistribution of wealth among the survivors, helped get market capitalism in gear, spurred the development of universities because of the excess capital that was lying around among the survivors.
Yes.
Gave rise to the age of exploration, and here we are.
Yes.
So it's not altogether a bad thing, but yes, backing up a bit, there are rumors. Apparently, there are some, or according to the internet, which means it must be true, that there are some bioweapons research facilities in and around Wuhan. So the idea is that it didn't come from the market; it came from the lab. So,
which brings up a question about knowledge and what people do and don't know.
Yes.
And so, China is this extraordinary place: 1.4 billion people. It's huge, and the country has just revolutionized itself. It's become from being a real third world place into being certainly an economic and political rival of the United States. Everyone's living standard is doing great. There are great scientific advances. Everything is just rushing ahead like a rocket ship. And to do that, the government has to exercise substantial control over its population. And it really carefully guards what people learn or know about. So it would be very reasonable the way the government just handles things is they don't routinely let bad news circulate because they're concerned that it could unhinge things. Maybe I've said this before. If you had to pick one word in America that epitomizes the place, you could say it might be freedom. And I think in China you might pick the word harmony.
Yes.
It's the idea, it's a Confucius kind of viewpoint. We're all together, we're all harmoniously living. The father, the mother, the child, the grandparents, the extended family, the city, the state, everywhere, right? And we're all interconnected, and we have this contract that keeps us together. And the job of the mandarins is to sort of make things work, and the job with the emperor, who is sort of the key to heaven, is to make everything work out. And so the premier, aka emperor of China, makes certain that people aren't disturbed by bad information. And were a panic to occur in a place like China, it would be pretty catastrophic, would it not?
Yes.
I mean, and so the government doesn't routinely say everything.
Yes, and I understand that there has been some sharp criticism, certainly from the international community of the Chinese about how they've handled this, and also from within China, that one of the lead physicians who helped discover this thing died of it, and,
yes.
and that has caused a bit of an outcry within China. I can imagine a situation where this could bring about some major political changes in China. I'm not sure it would, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. So, yeah, I don't know a lot about virology, but I have been trying to educate myself on this, and this seems to be if we discount the escaped bioweapon theory, that this seems to be an episode of spillover, when you've got a virus that inhabits a wild species with whom we don't have a lot of contact, suddenly spills over into Homo sapiens at one of these wet markets.
Yes,
this is an ideal place for this to happen, and it propagates tremendously well because we've got no natural immunity or antibodies or anything like that to this new virus that's been there all along. This Wuhan virus may be hundreds of thousands of years old, but we've just never been exposed to it, or if people did get exposed, it died out too fast to propagate when there were fewer people and more isolated. And this, with our modern technology, we're going to see this happen more and more and more.
Well, I'm not a virologist, but I'll just say one thing is if you have a very deadly virus like Ebola, it just kills everybody,
yes.
And so it can't spread easily.
Exactly.
And then if there's a very mild virus, it spreads and goes everywhere, like influenza A and B, so that every winter there's huge, you could call them pan-epidemics. Millions and millions of people have colds and viral symptoms, and it generally is of low virulence, and most people get through it okay. But this is kind of an intermediary, as far as one can say, issue. It's disturbing to me that that it's not been possible to get Western observers in easily into the city. I've heard reports, I mean, they're all secondhand, maybe they're apocryphal, that allegedly people have relatives in Wuhan, and the reports coming out, the government is tremendously downplaying what's happened here. And it really is much worse than the government has said. And it's really a dislocating issue.
Yes.
I'll say this, is the government correct in downplaying this? Is it correct to do that? I mean, what happens if people become very, very frightened? The great fear that happens. And one can say when epidemics occur, Black Death, people respond in different ways. And I think anti-Semitism is often people are scapegoated. And some people have said even, well, Chinese people coming in, maybe they're the carriers of this or whatever. And that's something to think about, isn't it? Is that if people get really frightened, they lose their rationality and they can start to attack innocent people. They can do all kinds of crazy things if they really, really get frightened. And the guillotine can appear. And you want to hit the ball on that. We could think about the Great Fear in France in the time of the Revolution, or many times you could think about the Salem witchcraft trials, whatever.
Which may in fact have had a biological explanation, which sort of brings around one of the interesting explanations of that was that there was a fungus that grew on the wheat supply and was essentially hallucinogenic in nature. And it had a biological event has a huge sociological, political repercussions.
I think we really have to say, just to go through this, the fact it emphasizes a few things to me. Number one is, what is the role of fear in the world? We have to be really careful about any country or nation that they get frightened. They do bad things if they really get frightened. In one's personal life, you get frightened, you can do stupid things, and countries can do the same thing. Also, the idea of truth is a big thing, and the public's right to know what exactly is happening. And it appears to me in China we're really not getting the story in regards to that. We haven't. Yes. They made wonderful steps in many ways. But they haven't let the experts in from the World Health Organization. As far as I know, the NIH gang and the CDC are really, really cutting edge. And if you really wanted to help, or everything is there, you'd bring those experts in.
Yeah, and they've been blocking that. On the other hand, they seem to be opening up somewhat. As of the day we're taping this, I think in the last 24 hours or so, they have started reclassifying this virus. They've just given it a new name, and I can't remember the new name they've given it. But they've also changed the criteria they've used to decide who qualifies for having contracted it, which has resulted in a vast adjustment upward of the number of people who have it. And that seems to indicate to me more of an openness. If you were a truly repressive regime, I don't think they ever would have done this. Now, is it enough, and has it happened soon enough? I don't know. But it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah. The world is such a short. Maybe my third point I could make about this is, it's such an interconnected world, such a small world. The traffic that's going back and forth over the Pacific to Europe, and it's extraordinary for me to see just how quickly this spread everywhere in the world, just like in a millisecond. It was everywhere.
Yes.
It's in all countries, all continents. One place of particular concern, I think, would be if the virus reached third world countries that don't have a powerful health infrastructure. What could happen? And I think one particular danger point might be Africa.
Yes.
And there's a substantial Chinese presence there. There are, I think, over a million, the number's right, over 1 million Chinese people work in Africa doing different things. There are lots of African students. I think the number is 30,000 in China. There's interchanges back and forth. So if something like that were to get loose in a developing country, it could be really catastrophic. The ability to do anything about it would just be terrible. And that means to me the danger has not totally gone away. Despite the optimism displayed at some quarters.
And the incubation period as well. If something erupts immediately, and I suppose the incubation period in the hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola, yes. It happens fast, it spreads fast, it burns out the local population. Right. But if it's a little bit slower and it gives you time to get on that plane and go somewhere and spread, and it can't be too fast, can't be too slow. I suppose the the other end of the spectrum would be HIV. It can take a long time to manifest.
Yeah.
Spreads very slowly and insidiously.
Right.
That's extremely dangerous. This one is fast enough that a good, vigorous quarantine might be able to shut it down. And the vast majority of these cases have shown up in China. But even so, I learned this morning there are something like 200 people in our own state of Georgia here who came in from China, and they are self-monitoring right now. Now, the odds of any of them having it are in fact very low. I don't think any of them came from Wuhan province. But it just shows how interconnected everything is. So.
Yes, it is. And I mean, I think it's complicated about the ability to do something here. Point number one is that if the death rate might not be as much in the U.S. if really a place, I'd say we're up there in our health resources. Yes. One of the things that happens is that if a person has a really bad flare-up, maybe they're going to need to be dialyzed, their kidneys may shut down, they have to be intubated, all the tricks of keeping people alive. And I think the resources are not there in China. Mm-hmm. And so that makes the death rate go up. An additional thing is that the problem with diagnosis. How many people actually have it, and how effective is it to basically just get a temperature? Does that say you have it or not have it, or if your temperature is up a little bit? Maybe if you're very, very sick, you could tell, but just in this prodromal period, it would be difficult to say who has it and who doesn't have it without pretty sophisticated tests. So I think the number of people that have this is a pretty substantial number. I don't know how effective different kinds of things are. It would appear to be somewhat reasonable to try and quarantine people. But actually, after people are through the net, they're out there on the street, they presumably could infect substantial numbers of people. Once again, it's not my field, but there's the ratio of infected people, how many you can infect, and I think that's a number the CDC could come up with. But allegedly, one person can infect different numbers of people, one person, 10 people. Understanding those numbers would be an issue of consequence. But it is a really spooky possibility. This may not be so much. Maybe this is going to be not such a big deal, but we have a lot of arrogance in our DNA that we're going to take care of this, and there's a lot of confidence out there that we can defeat anything. And if the villain is enough, it may be not so easy to do that. This may not be such a terrible villain. I mean, that's our hope. It's not such a big deal.
It might be a good wake-up call.
That's right. If we did, and to do that, to really understand how to deal with such situations, one would have to put a real important arrangement for world health care. We'd have to be able to understand, communicate back and forth. In some ways that's done, but really put it on steroids. Something is happening, and particular attention, I think, with contagious diseases to countries that don't have much or don't have an effective health infrastructure. I mean, those would be things that you could say would be something to think about.
Well, the struggle between nationalism and globalization, and we've talked about it some on previous shows. I mean, this would be a classic case for globalization, something that's bigger than any one nation, and so resources have to be shared, and that's crucial. But it's also a question of individualism versus collectivism. We're coming from a society that values individual autonomy. And of course, one of the most important types of autonomy is autonomy over your own body, your own physical person. But the problem here, and this is where collectivism has got an argument, what if the individual biological human person himself becomes the disease vector? Does that not give the community a degree of authority over him that would make the individualist very uncomfortable? Vaccination, for instance, quarantine, travel restrictions. Where the community can say to the individual, we're not asking you, we're telling you. And of course you get some of those nightmare scenarios, for instance, in the Stephen King novel, In the Stand. King was coming out of the turbulent Vietnam era when the establishment was seen as bad. But when this thing gets out of the lab and starts spreading, the military essentially comes in and takes over entire towns, kidnaps American citizens, puts them into disease centers, and uses them as guinea pigs to try to stop this thing. It's pretty oppressive stuff. Can we see something like that happening in the present day, and perhaps even in China, where there is less concern over individual autonomy?
Just so, suppose you quarantine Chicago. I mean, would that work? You're in Chicago, we're not letting you out. There are thousands of people who are sick and dying, and the crematoriums are working around the clock. Families are being destroyed. There's no factories, nothing. Or the military is driving around, and people are relatively quiescent about it. They're, oh, okay, that's the story. It might be very difficult to do something like that in the United States. I'll make one comment about this in our sort of global community here. It's not. There's the analogy between H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, these external invaders, and a war of our species against a small predatorial bacteria or virus. Maybe that's not so far-fetched. And if you can remember the War of the Worlds,
the thing that ended up saving us was
right. What was the bacteria,
Yes.
but it turned out to be a friend, and maybe one bacteria can eat the virus in the end. Maybe that's what would happen. But also another similar kind of story is the 4th of July. I mean, the outer space invaders are coming in. We're fighting them. But this is a pan-epidemic, would be a worldwide event that would cause all nations to try and get together and stop it. And
We
this
would
is sort
hope.
of right. And this
We would hope.
it brings up the idea of a global community, and I think that's an appropriate way to look at this. Disease issues are often universal. If you have a heart attack yourself, okay, that's your issue. But communicable diseases really reflect our whole community. So I think that's something to brood about.
Yes. It's an interesting thought, and one thing that occurs to me, and the idea of quarantining Chicago is not that far beyond the realm of possibility. I mean, we are seeing cruise ships that have been quarantined, and they are not permitted to dock. They have not been permitted to disembark passengers. And so you're here on a cruise ship, you've just gotten married, you're on your honeymoon cruise, and then suddenly the word comes over, we have several people, we have a dozen people with this virus on board. They're symptomatic, they're wheezing their lungs out, the HVAC system is sucking in their germs,
Well,
and you can't get off. Well, you have to stay here for 14 days.
well,
this has happened. There are 2 or 3 ships that they're going through this right now.
apparently you can't leave your cabin. At least I've heard the story. You're sort of stuck in your cabin. It might, doesn't sound too pleasant. Even if you're on your honeymoon, well, maybe it's okay. But for a while,
For the first 2 weeks,
for the first couple of weeks, it'll be okay. But as time goes by, it would be a little difficult. Well, we have these stories about China, our relationship with the Chinese. How are we going to handle that, do you think? I mean, it turns out they're not as powerful and as omnipotent as we imagine. The same with the Japanese. If you can remember in the early 80s, 1980s maybe, the Japanese were thought to have the perfect system. They were going to overwhelm us.
Yes.
And it turned out not to be the case.
Yes.
And we can also say the Russians were going to overwhelm us if we can go back in we've imagined that different nations are going to outdo us. Not that that's impossible, but I wonder if this just brings up a certain kind of...
it reveals human hubris.
Yes.
That what is our weakness? I mean, I guess
many of them.
I guess the weakness that I would immediately see in the United States would be the power grid. That our healthcare is some of the. Is there any other? Would you say that we've got the best healthcare system in the world? If you look at everything
I would say
combined?
the resources that exist to America to treat people is the best in the world. The problem we have is our citizens are not compliant. They've got their own, I guess, issues that sabotage their health. But if you're devoted to maintaining your good health, then you're in the right and you're in the right country. And one caveat to that is that you have a way to get into the system.
Yes.
So you have the ability to make use of it, and you're an intelligent person. You can really, really outdo other places. That'd be my thought.
So I would say, and of course I could be wrong. A weaponized bug could get out. There could be a spillover somehow that makes its way here and devastates us. But I would say that a big weakness that we have here, because we are so highly industrialized and developed, the power grid goes down. Some sort of major solar event. There was one of those in, I believe, the 1840s or 1850s that actually knocked out telegraph systems. Our grid is kind of old and aging, and it's subject to something like that. It's subject to hacking. There are doomsday scenarios where some rogue state like Korea gets hold of a few nukes and pops them off high in the upper atmosphere, causing the Compton effect, and the EMP shuts down our grid permanently. And without the grid, our society cannot sustain anywhere near the 300+ million people we have. And it gets ugly. If anyone's interested in reading this, the book that I read, one of the books that I read, there are many of them, 1 Second After is a pretty realistic picture of what happens, and it's not good. So with China, it's a bug. So for some of the underdeveloped countries, it may be a bug. For the industrial countries, it's something else. What do you do about this? Is the answer more government? Is it more regulation? What happens to individual autonomy?
Well, presumably it would be diminished. I mean,
Yes.
I think that's a fair story. If you have some kind of national crisis that requires collaboration, I mean, the whole system would shatter, just as it does in wartime. I mean, in war, it's quite common to have individual liberties removed. The government sends tanks in if they have to. Everyone marches in lockstep. And a terrific world crisis of any type, that's what would occur. And certainly there is enormous vulnerability about being connected to the infrastructure, to the grid, as you say, to have access to water, food. And there's a lot of fragility out there. It's interesting to think how things are going to go in China. If this process continues for a long period of time, how are people going to eat there? What's happening with the water, the sewerage? I mean, who's doing what in the city? And it's said that when the warm weather comes, things might get better. We'll just have to see what transpires along those lines.
Is there any way for the international community, and I know we're winding down here, to ostracize China? To say, you are anathema until you get your house in order in this regard? Does the international community have enough clout to make China do that? That's a whole other
I don't
topic,
think
so.
Well, I think the economic reality of the circumstances are what seems to count. And right now, China is a huge economic power in the world, and their interconnections go back and forth. The supply chain runs straight through China, and I think most governments would be loath to interfere with their economic circumstances.
Yes. Well, brave new world, I suppose.
Well, thank you for coming, Buck. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.